Gormenghast. Chapter 19. The margin of the forest under whose high branches Titus was standing was an interwoven screen of foliage, more like a green wall constructed for some histrionic purpose than a natural growth. Was it to hide away some drama that it arose there, so sheer and so thick? Or was it the backcloth of some immortal mime? Which was the stage and which the audience? There was not a sound. Titus, wrenching two boughs apart, thrust himself forward and wriggled into the green darkness, thrust again, prizing his feet against a great lateral root. The leaves and the moss were cold with the dew. Working forwards on his elbows, he found his way almost completely barred by a tough network of boughs, but the edge of his eagerness to break his way through was whetted, for a branch had swung back and switched him across his cheek, and in the pain of the moment he fought the muscled branches until the upper part of his body had forced a gap which he kept from reclosing with his aching shoulders. His arms were forward of his body, and he was able to free his face of the leaves, and, as he panted to regain his breath, to see ahead of him, spreading into the clear distances, the forest floor like a sea of golden moss. From its heaving expanses arose, as though the chimera of a daydream, a phantasmic gathering of ancient oaks. Like dappled gods they stood, each in his own preserve, the wide glades of moss flowing between them in swathes of golden green and away into the clear, dwindling distances. When his breath came more easily, Titus realized the silence of the picture that hung there before him. Like a canvas of gold with its hundreds of majestic oaks, their winding branches dividing and subdividing into gilded fingertips, the solid acorns and the deep clusters of the legendary leaves. His heart beat loudly as the warm breath of the silence flowed about him and drew him in. In his last wrench and thrust to escape from the marginal boughs, his coat was torn off bodily by a thorn tree with a hand of hideous fingers. He left it there, hanging from the branch, the long thorns of the tree impaling it like the fingernails of a ghoul. Once the noise of his flight with the branches had subsided, and the warm, everlasting silence had come down again, he stepped forward upon the moss. It was resilient and springy, its golden surface exquisitely compact. He moved again with a higher tread, and found that on landing it was the easiest thing in the world to float off into the next movement. The ground was made for running on, for every step lifted the body into the next. Titus leapt to his right and began to lope off down the dark green verge of the forest in giant bounds. The exhilaration of these flights through the air were for some while all-absorbing, but as their novelty staled, so there came a mounting terror, for the thick green of the forest's verge on his right appeared endless, stretching away as it did to the limit of his vision, and the motionless, soundless glow of the oaks and the great spaces of moss on his left seemed never to change, though tree after tree swam by him as he fled. Not a bird called, not a squirrel moved among the branches, not a leaf fell. Even his feet, when they struck the moss, were soundless. Only a faint sigh passed his ears as he floated, reminding him that there was such a thing as sound. And now what he had loved he loathed. He loathed this deadly, terrible silence. He loathed the gold light among the trees, the endless vistas of the moss, even the gliding flight from footmark to footmark, for it was as though he were being drawn toward some dangerous place or person, and that he had no power to hold himself back. The mid-air thrill was now the thrill of fear. He had been afraid of leaving the dark margin on his right, for it was his only hold upon his location, but now he felt it as part of some devilish plan, and that to cling to its tangled skirt would be to deliver himself to some ambushed horror. And so he turned suddenly to his left, and although the vistas of oak were now as sickening and phantom land, he bounded into its gold heart with all the speed he could. Fear grew upon him as he careered. He had become more an antelope than a boy, but for all his speed he must have been a novice in the art of travel, through moss leaping. For suddenly, while he was in mid-air, his arms held out on either side for balance, he caught sight, for the merest fraction of an instant, of a living creature. Like himself, it was in mid-air, but there was no other resemblance. Titus was heavily, if sparsely, built. This creature was exquisitely slender. It floated through the air like a feather, the slender arms along the sides of the gracile body, the head turned slightly away and inclined a little as though on a pillow of air. Titus was by now convinced that he was asleep, that he was running through the deep of a dream, that his fear was nightmare, that what he had just seen was no more than an apparition, and that though it haunted him, he knew the hopeless absurdity of following so fleeting a wisp of the night. Had he thought himself awake, he must surely have pursued, however faint his hope of overtaking the slender creature. For the conscious mind can be set aside and subdued by the emotions, but in a dream world all is logic. And so, in fear of the gold oak wood of his dream, he continued in his loping, effortless, soundless, dream-like bounds, deeper and deeper into the forest and over the elastic velvet of the moss. For all his conviction that he was asleep, and in spite of the resilience and apparent ease of his flight running, he had become very tired. The gilded and encrusted trunks of the great oak trees swam by him one after another. The emptiness seemed even more complete and terrible, since that will-o'-the-wisp had floated across his path. All of a sudden he became sharply aware of his fatigue and of hunger, and at the same time a weakening of his conviction that he was dreaming. If I was dreaming, he thought, then why should I need to spring from the ground? Why shouldn't I just be carried along? And to test his idea he made no further effort, merely keeping his balance in the air each time his drop to earth lifted him again into those long and fantastic cruises. But the impetus weakened with every dwindling flight, and the volitant boy came gradually to a standstill. With the rhythm of his progress broken, his belief that he was in a state of dream was finally dispelled, for his hunger had become insistent. He looked about him. The same scene enclosed him with its mellow cyclorama, its hateful dream of gold. But for all this horror, it had laid hold of him again now that he no longer believed himself asleep. His fear was in some way lessened by a peculiar thrill which seemed to grow in intensity rather than quieten until it had become a trembling globe of ice under his ribs. Something for which he had unconsciously pined had shown either itself or its emblem in the gold oak woods. Realizing that he had been wide awake ever since he had crept, how long ago, to the stables of Gormenghast, he knew that slender spectre, that reed-like, feather-like thing with its head turned half-way as it rose in slanting volutation across a glade as wide as a lawn, was true, was here in the oak forest with him at that very moment, was perhaps watching him. It was not only the uncanniness of such a phasma which haunted him now. It was his craving to see again that essence so far removed from what was Gormenghast. And yet, what had he seen? Nothing that he could describe. It had been so rapid, that flight across his vision. Gone, as it were, before his eyes were ready. The head turned away. Turned away. What was it that cried to him? What was it that this floating shred of life expressed? For in the air with which it had moved through space was a quality for which Titus unknowingly hungered. On this long glissade of the wasp-gold flight, like a figment from a rarer and more curious climate than Titus had ever breathed, it had expressed as it rose across the glade the quintessence of detachment, the sense of something intrinsically tameless, and of a distilled and thin air beauty. All this in a flash. All this a confusion in Titus's heart and brain. What he had felt when he had halted his horse that same morning and heard the voices of the mountain and the woods crying, "Do you dare?" was redoubled within him. He had seen something which lived a life of its own, which had no respect for the ancient laws of Gormenghast, for ritual among the foot-worn flagstones, for the sacredness of the immemorial house. Something that would no more think of bowing to the 77th Earl than would a bird or a branch of a tree. He beat his fist into the palm of his other hand. He was frightened. He was excited. His teeth chattered. The glimpse of a world, of an unformulated world, where human life could be lived by other rules than those of Gormenghast, had shaken him. But for all the newness, all the vague hugeness of the mutinous sensations that were thronging in him, yet under the pain of his hunger, even they began to give way to the consuming need for food. Was there a slightly different feeling about the light as it slanted through the oak leaves and lay along the glades? Was there a less deathly stillness in the air? For a moment Titus thought he heard a sigh among the leaves above him. Was there a quickening in the torpor of the midday stillness? There was no way for Titus to know which way to turn. He only knew that he could not return in the direction from which he had come. And so he began to walk as quickly, yet as lightly, as he could, to avoid the nightmare sensation that those loping and unbridled flights through the air had bred in him, in the direction in which the mysterious and floating creature had disappeared. It was not long before the peerless lawns of moss that stretched between the oaks became pranked by clumps of ferns, which, ignoring the sun's rays, appeared silhouetted, so dark was the viridian of their hanging fronds, so luminous their golden background. The relief to the boy's spirit was instantaneous, and when the sumptuous floor gave place to coarse grasses and the rank profusion of flowering weeds, and when, most refreshing of all to Titus's eyes, the oaks no longer cast their ancestral spell across the vistas, but were challenged by a variety of trees and shrubs, until the last of those gnarled monarchs had withdrawn, and Titus found himself in a fresher atmosphere, then, at last, he was clear of the nightmare, and, with his hunger for redundant proof, was once again in the clear, sharp, actual world that he knew. The ground began to drop away before him in a lively gradient. As on the far side of the oak forest, here also were scattered rocks and groups of ferns. And then all of a sudden Titus gave a shout of happiness to see a living thing after the emptiness and nervelessness of the golden glades. A dog-fox, that, disturbed by his footsteps, had woken out of its midday sleep in a quiet nest of ferns, had got to its feet with extraordinary self-possession and trotted away at an even pace across the slant of the falling ground. At the base of the slope a hazel wood began. Here and there a silver birch lifted its feathery head above the thicker foliage, or a dark green ilex seemed like a green shadow in the sunlight. Titus began to hear the voices of birds. How could he quieten his hunger? It was too early in the year for wild fruit or berries. He was utterly lost, and the exhilaration he had felt at escaping from the oak woods was beginning to dwindle and to turn into depression when, after threading his way for a little more than a quarter of a mile through the hazel trees, he heard the sound of water, faint but distinct, away to the west. At once he began to run in the direction of the cool sound, but was forced to relapse into a walking pace, for his legs were heavy and tired, and the ground was uneven and patched with ground ivies. But as the sound of the water grew momentarily louder, so the ilex trees began to grow more thickly among the hazels, so that there was a rich, dark, blackish-greenish about the shadows of the trees, both overhead and at Titus's feet. The water now sounded loud in his ears, but so dense had the trees become that it was with a sudden shock that the dazzling breadth of a fast, foam-streaked river appeared before him, and at that very instant, from out of the shadows of the wood on the opposite bank, there stepped a figure. He was a gaunt and masked creature, very tall and thin. His high, scrawny shoulders twisted forwards, his cadaverous head lowered, with the thinly bearded jaw protruding as though in defiance. He was clothed in what had once been a suit of black material, but was now so bleached by sun and soaked in 100 dews that it had become a threadbare blotchwork of olive and grey rags, indistinguishable among the leaves of the forest. As this gaunt figure stepped down to the water's edge, a sound of clicking that Titus could in no way account for floated over the bright waters. It appeared to break out at his every step, like a distant musket shot or the breaking of a dry twig, and to cease whenever he stopped moving. But Titus soon forgot about this peculiar noise, for the man on the opposite bank had reached the river and waded out to where a flat, sun-baked rock the size of a table basked in the midstream. As he extracted from among his rags a length of line and a hook, and as he began to fix the bait, he glanced about him, comparatively carelessly at first, and then with a dawning apprehension, until finally he dropped his line upon the rock beside him, and sweeping the opposite shore with his eyes, he focused them on Titus. Partially shielded behind a heavy branch of leaves, Titus, who had made no sound, was horrified at being so suddenly discovered, and the blood rushed into his face. But he could not take his eyes from those of the emaciated man. He was now crouching on the rock. His small eyes, which had burned beneath his rock-like brows, now glittered with a peculiar light, and all at once his hoarse voice sounded across the river. "My lord!" It was a sharp, rough cry, with a catch in the throat as though the voice had not been sounded for a long while. Titus, whose instincts had been torn between flying from those hot, wild eyes and his excitement at finding another human being, however emaciated and uncouth, stepped forward into the sunlight at the river's edge. He was frightened, and his heart beat loudly, but he was famished also and deadly weary. "Who are you?" he cried. The figure stood up on the hot rock. His head was thrust forward towards Titus. His tall body trembled. "Flay!" he said at last, his voice hardly audible. "Flay!" cried Titus. "I've heard of you!" "Aye!" said Flay, his hands gripped together. "Likely enough, my lord. They told me you were dead, Mr. Flay. No doubt of it." He looked about him again, taking his eyes from Titus for the first time. "Alone?" His interrogation sounded hoarsely across the water. "Yes," said Titus. "Are you ill?" Titus had never seen so gaunt a man before. "Ill, lordship? No, boy, no. But banished." "Banished?" cried Titus. "Banished, boy. When you were only when your father, my lord—" He ended suddenly. "Your sister Fuchsia? She's all right." "Ah," said the thin man. "No doubt of it." There was a note almost of happiness in his voice, but then, with a new note, "You're done, me lord, and windless. What brought you?" "I escaped, Mr. Flay. Run away. I'm hungry, Mr. Flay." "Escaped?" whispered the long man to himself with horror. But he gathered and pocketed his hook and line and withheld 100 burning questions. "Water's too deep. Too fast here. Made crossing. Boulders. Half-mile upstream. Not far, lordship, not far. Follow your edge with me. Follow your river edge, boy. We'll have a rabbit." He seemed to be talking to himself as he waded back to the bank on his side of the river. "Rabbit and pigeon and a long cabin sleep. Blown, he is. Son of Lord Sepulcrave. Ready to drop. Tell him anywhere. Eyes like her ladyship's. Escaped from the castle. No. Mustn't do that. Oh, no. Must send him back. 77 Earl. Had him in me pocket. Size of the monkey. Long ago. And so Flay rambled on as he strode along the bank, with Titus following him on the opposite shore, until after what seemed an endless journey by the water's edge, they came to the crossing of boulders. The river ran shallowly at this point, but it had been no easy work for Flay to shift and set the heavy boulders in place. For 5 years they had stood firm in the rushing water. Flay had made a perfect ford, and Titus crossed at once to him. For a moment or two they stood awkwardly staring at each other, and then, all of a sudden, the cumulative effect of his physical excitement, the shocks and privations of the day, told upon Titus, and he collapsed at the knees. The gaunt man caught him up in an instant, and putting the boy carefully over his shoulder, set off through the trees. For all his apparent emaciation, there was no question as to Mr. Flay's stamina. The river was soon left far behind. His long, sinewy arms held Titus firmly in place across his shoulder. His lank legs covered the ground with a long, thin, muscular stride, and, save for the clicking of his knee joints, with peculiar silence. He had learned during his exile among the woods and rocks the value of silence, and it was second nature for him to pick his way over the ground like a man born to the woods. The pace and certainty of his progress testified to his intimate knowledge of every twist and turn of the terrain. Now he was waist-deep in a valley of bracken. Now he was climbing a slope of reddish sandstone. Now he was skirting the rock face, whose crown overhung its base and whose extensive surface was knuckly with the day's nests of innumerable martins. Now he had below him a drop into a sunless valley, and now the walnut-covered slopes, from where each evening, with hideous regularity, a horde of owls set sail on bloody missions. When Flay, topping the brow of a sandy hill, stood for a moment, breathing heavily, and stared down into the little valley, who had insisted upon walking by himself for some while past, for even Flay had not been able to sustain his weight during the uphill climbs, stopped also, and with his hands on his knees, his tired legs rigid, he leaned forward in a position of rest. The little valley or dell beneath them was shut in by tree-covered slopes, save to the south, where walls of rock, overgrown with lichen and mosses, shone brightly in the rays of the declining sun. At the far end of this grey-green wall were 3 deep holes in the rock, 2 of them several feet above the ground, and one at the level of the valley's sandy floor. Along the valley ran a small stream, broadening out into an extensive pool of clear water in the centre, for at the far end of the lake, where it had narrowed to a tongue, was a rough dam. Long evenings had been spent in its making, simple as it was. Flay had hauled a couple of the heaviest logs he could manage and laid them close to one another across the stream. Titus could see them plainly from where he stood, and the thin stream of the overflow at the dam's centre. The sound of this overflow trilled and splashed in the silence of the evening light, and the little valley was filled with its glass-like voice. They descended to the patchwork valley of grass and sand and skirted the stream until they reached the dam and the broad expanse of the trapped water. Not a breath of air disturbed the tender blue of its grass-like surface in which the hillside trees were minutely reflected. Rows of stakes had been driven into and against the inner sides of the logs to form a crib. This space had been filled with mud and stones until a wall had risen and the lake had formed, and a new sound had come to the valley, the tinkling sound of the glittering overflow. A few moments later they were at the mouth of the lowest of the openings into the rock. It was but a cleft, about the width of an ordinary door, but it widened into a cave, a spacious and fern-hung place. This inner cave was lit by the reflected light thrown from the sides of the wide natural chimneys, whose vents were those mouth-like openings in the rock face a dozen feet above the entrance. Titus followed Flay through this fissure-like doorway, and when he had reached the cool and roughly circular floor of the inner cave, he marvelled at its lightness, although it was not possible for a single ray of the sun to pierce unhindered. for the wide rocky chimneys wound this way and that before they reached the sunlight. Yet the sunbeams reflected from the sides of the winding chimneys flooded the floor with cool light. It was a high domed place, this cave, with several massive shelves of rock and a number of natural ledges and niches. On the left-hand side, the most impressive of these natural outcrops stood out from the wall in the form of a 5-sided table with a smooth, shelving top. These few things Titus was able to take in automatically, but he was too exhausted and sick with hunger to do more than nod his head and smile faintly at the long man, who had lowered his tilted head at Titus as though to see whether the boy was pleased. A moment later, Titus was lying on a rough couch of deep, dry ferns. He closed his eyes and, in spite of his hunger, fell asleep.